This is the Comics Alternative Interviews, a conversation with Erin Nations. Greetings to all, and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Interviews. I'm Derek, and on this show I talk with Erin Nations, whose Gumballs collection was just released by Top Shelf. But before we get to that conversation, I want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Interviews is brought to you by the wonderful folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts can be anywhere from 20 to 35% off of the cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some mind-blowing specials. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off of the cover price. Sometimes 50% off cover. But occasionally, you can find discounts that are even more impressive than that. And if you go to DCB Service right now, you'll find, as you usually do, incredible savings on a variety of comics, including bundles of titles from such publishers as Valiant, Marvel, and DC, as well as great discounts on individual issues and volumes. And since today I'm talking with Erin Nations, it's worth noting that if you go to DCB Service right now, you'll find his Gumballs trade paperback at 35% off of the cover price. That's just $12.99, a price that gives you no excuse not to delve into the world of Gumballs. Whatever kind of comics you enjoy reading, you really can't beat the prices at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to dcbservice.com for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your titles there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you. In December of 2016, Top Shelf published the first issue of Erin Nations' Gumballs, the first of 4 issues that would be released over the course of the following year. This quarterly ran as a one-person anthology, a collection of stories and observations, many of which were autobiographical in nature. Gumballsstood stood out among its peers in that it recalled the kind of comic books we used to get from other alternative creators, such as Seth, Daniel Clowes, and Chris Ware. Now, those creators have turned to the graphic novel or book form, but it's a rarity that we get a comic book like this, making Gumballsstand stand out as a title of note. Now, those 4 issues have been collected as a trade, one that has just been made available in the direct market, and next week will be out for wider release. In this interview you're about to hear, I talk with Erin Nations about the genesis of his Gumballsseries, his thoughts on being an autobiographical cartoonist, how he uses comics to chronicle his transitioning, and the various tones he strikes among the many stories contained within his series. This is an insightful conversation with Erin, and let's listen to that right now. I have the pleasure of talking with Erin Nations. His recent collection, Gumballs, came out recently from Top Shelf. Erin, how are you doing?
I'm doing good, thank you.
And, we should mention that your collection, Gumballs, brings together those initial 4 issues of Gumballs that you released, I guess beginning in either, December of 2016 or January of 2017?
Yeah, it was December 2016.
Yes, and I remember my co-host at the time and I reviewed Gumballs #1 for the show. So it's good to have you on after the completion of at least the first 4 issues.
Yes.
Now, let me start off by asking you about the title, Gumballs. What's the deal with the title?
That was Brett Warnock, he was actually one of the founders of Top Shelf. I took a class from him, probably five years ago now. And he became like a mentor and actually helped me put this together. And we were kind of like thinking of ideas, and he had commented on how colorful the artwork was, and he's like, it's very candy colored.
Oh.
So I was thinking of colorful candy, and gumballs came to mind, but also I was thinking like a gumball machine, you get like all these different flavors, and I'm like, well, there's a lot of different stories as well. It's just not like one focus. So I guess that's sort of how Gumballs became what it is.
That really makes sense. And you're talking about the different flavors. Now, describe, for those of our listeners who may not be familiar with Gumballs, well, first and foremost, shame on them. But for the uninitiated, how would you describe the series Gumballs?
It's kind of like an anthology of work, but, you know, like in a quarterly comic book. It's definitely not I wouldn't say it's very traditional. It's a lot of autobiographical comics. They're all pretty short, but then you have these like random like one pagers where it's just like interactions with people I deal with at work, or there's like personal ads that I created. There's like visual diaries. So yeah, that's how I would describe it.
And you know, that is kind of a rarity nowadays. We don't get many, I guess, single author anthologies, if you want to call them that. Especially in individual comic book form. And I found it interesting, on the very back of the trade Gumballs, there's an image of you looking at various comics, and beside you are Ghost World, This One Summer. But also I found it curious that another title you have sitting next to you that you're reading is Optic Nerve.
Yeah, that was, I read a lot of Optic Nerve, although I went back to read like because I discovered Erin Tomina. I've
heard it pronounced when he was on NPR a few years ago as Tomini, but
okay. I will listen to interviews just so I can hear what the last name is. I'm like, I don't know, it's so different. But I came across like some of his books, and then I started like going back and reading like the actual individual ones and collecting them. So he was sort of like an early influence.
So you're attempting, at least the way I read it, in Gumballs, to do something somewhat similar to what Tomini does in Optic Nerve. And I guess what earlier comics creators like Seth and Chester Brown, and even Chris Ware to some degree, did with their early comics, and that is release individual issues with various stories. And sometimes those storylines would, you know, pick up from one issue to the next, but many times they were standalone stories.
Yeah, exactly. Those are the kind of comics I was reading in like Daniel Clowes' 8-Ball too.
Yeah, 8-Ball's a good one, yeah. And, you know, this is interesting in that, except for Tomini, all of those other examples really don't exist anymore, at least in terms of comic book form, right? I mean, we do have Seth's Palookaville, but that comes out in graphic novel form. And then Daniel Clowes has more or less given up what he had been doing in 8-Ball to focus on books. So you're in many ways with Gumball kind of reverting to an older kind of alternative comic. And I was wondering about the decisions that went into that.
Again, that was like that was something like Brett had kind of like suggested, because when we met up, because we hadn't seen each other in years, and he was asking like if I'd ever want to be published and if I'd want to create something, and I was like, of course. In my mind, I was like wanting to put together like a graphic novel, sort of probably like an autobiographical memoir, and he was the one who sort of suggested like, wouldn't it be cool if you did something like either quarterly or if you wanted to do it every month. I was a little apprehensive at first because that's not what I envisioned, but I'm actually, I like doing it. I'm glad I did go for it because it is something different that I don't see that often.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that really makes it stand out among all of the other releases, and not just in terms of the mainstream, but also in terms of, I guess, more indie or alternative titles, whatever you choose to call them. I mean, it's not often that we get comic books. I mean, graphic novels or longer form narrative, yeah. I mean, there's a lot of that. But in the comic book format, no. And so I think Gumballs, for me at least as a reader, really stood out because of that.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. You were talking about the autobiographical idea at one point. We should mention to our listeners who aren't familiar with Gumballs that there is a lot in Gumballs that is autobiographical. And in fact, you know, if individuals got your 4 issues that came out over the past year or so, or if they get this new trade, I think to some degree, if they just pick out your autobiographical pieces in the collections, then there's I think that there's a solid narrative. In other words, we can see you in the way that you represent your life and your transitioning from the first issue, and there is some progress from the first to the second, from the second to the third, and then from the third to the fourth. And I think you see this clearly in the trade where you're making progress, you're making changes, and you point this out to the reader.
Yeah, for sure. No, I agree 100%. And I've had people comment on that, and like they're like, oh, I felt like this is very personal, and like you can still, even if these are a lot of short stories, it still comes together as a whole. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it does. But at the same time, you pepper the text with other stories as well, and not just stories, but something that I found interesting are, do you call them, would you call them personal ads? There's something like that almost.
Oh yeah. That's what I they were just like fictional personal ads that I started making up one day. So I incorporate those as well.
And I was wondering, where did that come from?
I have no idea. Maybe just from reading like, I don't even know if they really make those anymore now that there's like dating apps, but I mean, just reading in like, even like we have like the Portland Mercury, and they used to have like those in the back of the paper, and it would be like, advertisements. And so I wanted to do that, make these ads, and then add a little like illustration of what the person probably looks like.
And these are hilarious. You got characters like Dwayne, Milo, Herbert, and that's just scratching the surface. It's funny because, I mean, they are humorous. And while once I want to kind of laugh at these individuals, at the way they represent themselves, on the other hand, I think you write their story, or their ad, if we want to call it that, with a kind of empathic tenderness.
Yeah, I feel like they're all kind of self-deprecating, but they're okay with it. Mm-hmm. And I do have I've had like people I know who've like, oh, can you make me one? And I'm like, I would probably point out all your shortcomings, like, or the thing. I'm like, it wouldn't be funny if it's perfect. And I think people would probably want to make themselves sound perfect. So I do the opposite.
Yeah. Well, along with this, I was also curious if there are perhaps parts of yourself that you have injected in these ads for sure. as well, because the kind of self-deprecating nature that you mentioned of these various personal ads seem to fit comfortably with the way, at times, not with every story, but at times, that you represent yourself in your own plight.
Yeah, I agree. There's definitely little parts of myself that I exaggerate and put in the ads. But I think even all the fictional, even like Tobias, I think in a lot of ways is even parts of myself that I'm putting into him.
And in fact, I wanted to ask you about Tobias, because he is one of the first, if not the first. No, he's not the first, but he's one of the first ads that we get. In other words, I don't think we have an ad, no, because you introduce sort of like him with Meet Tobias.
Yeah, and it's kind of like an intro of him, and then it leads into these actual like comics about him.
Mm-hmm. And throughout the 4 issues, or this new trade, you keep coming back to Tobias. And so I was curious, what is it about Tobias that you made his story a major part of Gumballs that stands, quite strongly alongside yours?
It was just another thing that I was working on. I was kind of like, all these things were like separate things that I'd been working on when I put this together. And so this was just another character, another comic I was creating. So I was like, why not just throw this in with all the other comics I was working on? So that's really the only reason why.
And Tobias, in many ways, is like the various personal ads that you have sprinkled throughout Gumballs, in that he's self-deprecating to some degree. He seems to be kind of a pathetic character, but one that in certain ways we can identify with. And again, I mean, you handle that with kind of an empathic tenderness.
Yeah.
Story.
I agree.
Yeah. And So you see some of yourself also in Tobias's story.
Yeah, not 100%, but there are things about myself that I think I've probably put in there. I don't know, not necessarily maybe consciously, but whenever I will look back and read it, I'll be like, oh, that definitely sounds like something I would probably do.
And you had mentioned a moment ago that your friends were wanting you to include them in terms of these personal ads. Were there other people in your life, friends or family members, I mean, in addition to your two sisters, that you did include maybe in a very masked way in Gumballs?
There's definitely friends that'll pop up in the comic, but I don't necessarily put their name in it, unless they want me to. But there's such like a small, like maybe they'll appear in one panel that it's not really, no one has like this really developed storyline of people that I know other than just like myself. But, and I did even ask when I started making the comics about my sisters, I did ask them if it'd be okay if I included their names. And one of my sisters did ask to change her name just because she wanted to be separated from it. But I'm thinking with internet these days, people would figure it out if they really wanted to. Yeah, I will definitely ask if I wanted to incorporate someone. Although with coworkers, I do have coworkers in my comics, and for some of them, I have changed even the way they look, just because some of my coworkers have found out that I make comics and they want to read it, and it's like I don't want to include someone if they're not without their permission. So sometimes I'll just change their name and the way they look, so it won't be too obvious.
You know, I wanted to ask you about that. You mentioned the awareness of your coworkers in terms of your work in comics. One of the things that comes out of Gumballs in your own personal story is that, especially early on, you're, I guess, fairly uncertain, definitely self-conscious about your transitioning and what your coworkers, what the people around you may or may not know. So I'm wondering, in creating Gumballs, you're exposing yourself, obviously, because you're writing about your own life, even if it's in a somewhat masked way. Yeah. What were some of the challenges for you, or even the struggles in writing about yourself and what you were going through?
I didn't really find it like as far as like being so open and sharing these openly. Is that what you're asking? Yeah,
I mean, did you struggle with that? In other words, did you think, should I or shouldn't I? Am I exposing myself a little too much here?
Not really, because when I first started making the comics about my transition, I was putting those on Tumblr, which was something that I knew no one I knew has Tumblr accounts. So I'm like, it was a way to put it out there and like still be able to it was like a therapeutic thing. Like I could make this and talk about it openly and put it out here, and I knew no one was going to see it. But yet there are people strangers I don't know, who would see it, and then like just seeing them read it or relate to it. That felt good to me. So it's like, I didn't start sharing. I mean, once I was already out being trans once I got this, like I was a year into my transition once I got published by Top Shelf. And, so it's like by that time it was no big deal. I wasn't really concerned if people would read them.
Okay. So some of these comics originally appeared on your Tumblr site.
They did, yeah. I redrew some of them just because it wasn't even that long ago, but it's like my style has evolved a bit and gotten a little bit cleaner. So some of them I kind of like rewrote or I redrew. I definitely had to edit the grammar because my spelling and grammar is not always the best. But and I also since then have taken all of them down. I think there's a couple still up there, just if they had like a lot of attention around them. But for the most part, I just got rid of all those. Unless they're still out there. I don't know. I think once you have something on Tumblr, even if you delete it, it might still be there. So I don't know. It's the internet. Things can last forever there.
And I'm also curious if any of these comics that you published in Gumballs appeared in other publications, like for instance, Original Plumbing Magazine.
Yeah, no, those don't appear in here. And they were just like a couple things that I had submitted. And one was like years before I'd ever even been published and was even like really making comics. And I did one, I think it was last year, But yeah, I don't include those. Those are completely separated. But although the only other thing that really appears, Tobias appears in Portland. We have it's like a free comics newspaper called Vision Quest, and that's where I first started sharing comics of Tobias. And then I started incorporating them into Gumballs. So that's really the only thing that you're gonna. Although actually, I just remember there is one in the trade paperback. There is a comic that is also featured in the Full Bleed magazine.
The first issue?
Yeah, the first issue. Mm-hmm. I think it's the one Teenage Boy. That one I was first appeared in Full Bleed.
Yeah. Now, we mentioned that in Gumballs, there's a lot of it that's autobiographical, but also there's quite a bit that isn't. And even when you do write about your life, sometimes it's not really, I guess, what I would call autobiographical. It just kind of taps into your experience. Like, for instance, working in produce. There are a variety of just short one-pagers where it's you talking with a customer about something that is really ridiculous, whether it's about produce or something else. Like at one point, I think you were talking with a customer about balloons. And not that this is necessarily autobiographical, but it is based on your life. So I'm curious, given your work in Gumballs, do you, and elsewhere, do you consider yourself primarily an autobiographical comics artist or otherwise?
No, I'd say autobiographical, because I think just about the majority of the stuff that I do create, even if it's not on Gumballs, it's always, I don't know, it still tends to be about myself. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if it's just because it's easiest to write from my own experience. And even when I do create something fictional, I still feel like it's something that I'm pulling from my own life. I'm just kind of maybe changing it a bit and changing the name of the character, but I still feel like it's still me in some way.
Yeah. And, in some of these autobiographical pieces that make up Gumballs, you put yourself out there in a way that I think, I don't know if I could. It really takes a lot of guts. Stories like Packing and Irrational Fears, which I think is rather timely. You talk about the struggles, like for instance, with Irrational Fears, the struggles with using public restrooms. Yeah.
It's when I'm making those, it's like when you're making these comics, like you're normally just like in your, or like if you have a studio in your room, you're just like by yourself creating these. And I don't really think of how this is going to be put out into the world until I realize it's like the release date and that book is out there. I'm like, people are going to see all these and read about them. I don't know how many times I've drawn myself on a toilet. It's just, or there's some stuff I wrote and I was like, oh, my grandma read that, and I'm just like, I don't know if I would have told something, like been so open otherwise to a complete stranger. But when I'm making them, I just don't really think about that. Mm-hmm. But I'm also like, what? It's something that we can all, like, people are going to be able to relate to. And it's not, it's just, we're all human, and so I don't think it's embarrassing or anything. It's just like people are going to take something from it and like just be able to understand my experience from it.
So as you're creating the comics, you really don't think in terms of, what might my parents think about this, or what might my close friends consider in terms of this story?
No, every now and then I might, and then I'm just like, it doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. If it did come to my mind and something I felt like I cannot reveal, so I probably wouldn't. But most of it, I'm totally comfortable with sharing.
Yeah. And, while there are those quite personal, disclosive pieces like Packing and Irrational Fears, on the other hand, you include autobiographical pieces that don't really expose you, but just talk about what you're doing in your life. And I think one that I am remembering is 1 week at the Sou'wester, where you talk about what you did for that week when you were at the Sou'wester. But you have other pieces like that as well, about what you did like during a day, biking, seeing things, stopping off the side of the road and reading. And these are, quaint, really kind of relaxing disclosive pieces that stand in contrast to those other autobiographical stories where you do kind of expose yourself in certain ways.
Yeah. And it's like, I don't even do that intentionally. It's just a thing of like, this is something else I'm working on and I'm going to put this in here. But I really like to, and it's been a while since I've done that, but I do enjoy like just reflecting on the things I did in the day. And it is calming to do that.
In that sense, do you consider those kind of comics something like diary comics?
Oh yeah, for sure. That's sort of like, that's why it's like they're visual. I call them visual diaries. And so, yeah, for sure. Although I feel like all of it, like even the ones where I'm talking about my transition, I feel like even that's like some of those actually did originate from like journal entries that I had. And it's all sort of just like therapeutic to write about it and draw about it.
Mm. And, you know, there are a variety of comics creators who specifically work in the diary comic form where their entries, they actually date, you know, as one would in a journal or a diary. You know, on this particular date, this is what I did in this story. I mean, had you considered writing in that form?
I have actually. And I was just like, but then I'm like, this has been done before. So do I want to like create another like diary type, even if like comic, but, yeah, I've considered it, but I just figured maybe I should do something different or more original.
Mm-hmm. Another thing that stands out to me in Gumballs is the number of times you keep coming back to your sisters. And we should mention that you were one of triplets.
Yes.
And that becomes a major part of your life story. I don't think it's, you know, the big part of Gumballs. I mean, it's the transitioning, obviously, that is the main autobiographical narrative, but you keep coming back to your sisters. And I'm wondering, what's the draw? What's the pull? What kind of impact did growing up as one of three have on you and who you've become?
You know, it's like that was something that was like the first comics I started making were about my sisters, and I thought I'd put those in, but I had kind of thought like, is this something that needs to be included? Like, because sometimes I feel like this isn't really necessary, which is like why I would kind of like to do like an actual autobiographical, like graphic novel where it's like, it does more create, like I do talk more about my upbringing as a triplet with my sisters, because I do think that was part of like, and having like, because I'm one of an identical and I also have a fraternal, my other sister's fraternal. So it's like growing up, we're sort of like, me and my identical sister were kind of treated as this one person. So it's sort of like growing up, you're like kind of questioning your own identity and how am I separate from this person? And so I haven't really delved like really too much into that, but I think that's something I wanted to do. What I incorporate in Gumball seems to just be like short little anecdotes of just us like as kids and some of the goofy stuff we would do or whatever. But I think originally I wanted that to be a little bit maybe more deeper and you know, sort of talk more about how that affected, you know, coming to terms with my own identity when you're kind of lumped up with this other person where people see you as one person.
Yeah. You know, early in Gumballs, or at least the trade, and this may have been in issue number 2, maybe it was 1, your one-pager birthday party kind of underscores the identity issues quite nicely, because in this story you have, it's subtitled, "This is what happens at birthday parties with triplets." And there's a girl who invites the three of you to her birthday party, and you guys say, "Awesome." And her response is, "Radical, 3 presents." And then you invert that. Literally, you visually invert the arrangement when the three of you have a birthday party and the girl brings 1 present for the 3 of you.
Yeah, that happened all the time.
Really? Not just once or twice?
Oh yeah, it happened before, or it's just like 1 present for like, because we'd have like our own friends too, and they would just be like, "Well, here's like 1 present for you, and not for the other 2." Yeah, luckily family never did that, but that had happened with friends before.
Then you have other stories like one later in the trade, and I think it was issue number 4, Super Soakers, which is kind of a grossly funny story of what you and one of your sisters experienced with some boys in the neighborhood.
Yeah, got in a little fight, and they got their super soakers and filled it with pee and got us. And it was pretty gross.
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me that boys did that, although I don't know. I wouldn't think of peeing in a super soaker, though.
Yeah, I don't know how they thought of that one, but I mean, once we realized what it was, I don't know if we're both grossed out and horrified that someone would do that. And I remember telling our dad, and I think he was just equally as like, what? Like confused, and just told us to go take a bath immediately, basically. But in retrospect, I'm like, why didn't you go and like talk to those kids? Like go find the parents or something. But unless I don't know. I don't know what, it was so long ago.
Mm. Yeah, and not only with your sisters, but your childhood as a whole. Throughout Gumball, you tap into the kind of things that you experienced growing up and how they led you to be the person that you are today. Like, for instance, there's one piece, Childhood Infatuation, where you point out that, you and your sisters had certain infatuations, but very early on, and this appeared I remember it was striking when I read the very first issue, you talk about the significance of the Rob Reiner film Stand By Me and what impact that had on you.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if you could speak more to that, because you mentioned Stand By Me a few times in this collection.
Oh, yeah, that's like one of my favorite movies. I just connected to that whenever I saw it, just like anytime there's like, even like The Outsiders, one I really do like Greaser subculture, but in that era, but just feeling like I wanted to be one of those boys, and just seeing myself in them, but still having this understanding that I wasn't like them. Yeah, I don't know.
Now, maybe I'm reading too much into the arrangement of your stories. And so tell me if I'm just, some kind of egghead academic reading too much into this. But I find it curious that in this trade, which again collects all 4 issues of Gumball that we've seen so far, one of the first stories is Stand By Me, your reference to what that movie did to you, what kind of impact it had, and how you were drawn to the boys in that movie. Then the collection ends with the story Well-Behaved Boys. And so you're dealing with, albeit a non-cinematic community of boys, but the impact that it had on you is radically different. And I found that a curious bookend.
Yeah, it was weird that you pointed that. I didn't even like think of that, with how it started to how it ended, with the contrast of like, how you get these young boys in the beginning who are on this like adventure and just like coming of age. So yeah, the fact that the end of it, it's boys probably of the same age who are basically, singling me out and like harassing me, and just growing up being socialized as female, being seen female, and how you're treated by guys growing up, being harassed by them. Yeah, I don't know what else to add to that.
Yeah, and I found that last piece, Well-Behaved Boys, quite powerful, and not only sat alongside the Stand By Me piece that opens the collection, but just on its own, because one of the things that you do is you start with your own personal experience, and it's almost as if by the very end of that story, you broaden things out to talk about the larger social implications of how, young boys are trained to view women.
Yeah, and then like for such as like these boys, here they are like pinning me to a tree and like looking at my skirt. And it's like, then you grow up and the older you get, it's like they're catcalling you. They're saying inappropriate stuff to you. I mean, from coworkers to just strangers. And I'm sure it's just how the difference of how we're raised and how we're taught to act and be. Yeah.
Yeah. And as you point out toward the end of that story, you say, over the past 2 years, the sexual harassment has dissolved as I become more masculine looking. Men's desire to demonstrate their power over me has decreased. And you present a series of 4 images of yourself over time as you're transitioning where you do become more masculine. And I get the sense at the very end of the story that now you're in a unique position in that, having been born with certain expectations of being a female and having men, especially young boys, treat you in a certain way, now being seen as male, that you have inside information, if you want to call it that, or a unique perspective at least, that most people don't, and that you can speak from a position that not only men, but also women may not possess.
Yeah. I mean, well, I feel like for one, men won't always listen to women. And so it's like, I feel like if men, I mean, and it doesn't always, some men still will view me as a woman or, and I'll still have sometimes a hard time speaking up to strangers that, like in a public situation, like if it feels too dangerous, but I feel like I'm in this position being seen as a man that I can talk to other men and be like, if they say something inappropriate about women or to a woman, to call them out on it. And I mean, all men should do that. But knowing with that experience of what that's like, I feel like I'm more in tune to it. And, especially at work, it seems to happen with coworkers sometimes where I just feel like the moment they say something, just more inclined to like call them out on whatever shitty thing they might say to someone or about a woman, which is actually what happened in the last panel of that comic. That was an actual incident that happened. With this, I now have access to like this privilege. It's like, I'm not going to like sit back and just like let stuff like that slide.
Yeah, and that last panel that you're referring to, and this is, I think it's quite powerful, especially since it's the very last panel. I mean, if we discount the acknowledgement page that follows, this is the very last panel that the reader ends on, and it's almost like a kind of a sending forth, almost like with a social mission. It's your responsibility, everyone, to kind of, especially men, to speak out about this, because your coworker says, "I was thinking of telling Deb she's done a great job at losing the baby weight." Or what if I tell her she has great legs? And then you point out that this is a demeaning way of interacting with others. And the sad thing is, this coworker of yours doesn't even realize that that's the case.
I still don't even think I no longer work with him, but I still don't think he understood it. It's just like too often, when people compliment women, it's always on their looks or their body. And it's like, it's never based on things that they're like capable of doing. So like, even in that comic, I think I say something like, like compliment her on what a hard worker she is. Things like that. It's just like, don't always just like zero in on a woman's looks and body, which is what people do often, especially, or what men will do.
And you experienced some of this, if we can call it maybe unthinking sexism, yourself.
Oh, like in the past?
Yes.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
So again, that kind of gives you a unique position where you've experienced this stuff, but now you can speak to it in a way that others can't.
Yeah, and I think back then I just was more passive and more, I still can be passive at times. And I don't know if I just feel more confident now or that, I don't know what it is. Maybe it's just like people are talking more about it and to not let it slide that, it's still hard for me to like confront people because I am such a shy person that it's like, it can be really uncomfortable, but, you have to do it. So I'm still learning and I'm working on it.
You know, it's interesting that you point that out, because one of the things that I noticed is throughout the book, especially the early part of the trade, in the earlier issues of Gumball, you do point out how you're kind of shy, and maybe along with that, you don't speak out in ways that you would have liked. And I'm thinking of a relatively early story that may have appeared in issue number 2, Break Room, where you're at work and you're with a coworker, and your coworker makes some kind of snide comment about Bruce Jenner transitioning, and you
it's Kathleen Jenner now, though.
Yes, and how you just sat there and you didn't say anything, but then afterwards you felt really bad about not saying anything.
Yeah, and that was very I think I had only been on testosterone for a month, so I wasn't even out. I was really scared about if I stood up for another trans person, it would reveal that I was trans, and I just wasn't ready to share that. I mean, if that were to happen now, I definitely would not have let that slide. But back then, it was just, I was so scared of what that meant if someone were to find out, even though I knew it eventually would come out. But yeah, so it's much different back then compared to now.
And do you feel that your process of transitioning, where you are now compared to where you were then, that has also fed into, I guess, more of a willingness to speak out, to put yourself out there, more verbosity? Less shy. Sure. Less shy, in other words.
Oh, gosh, I still feel like I'm very shy, but I think it's easier to, I mean, I guess it just depends on the circumstance. I think at work I'm more comfortable because so many people know now that it's just I'm not so and people might ask questions and I'm more open to talk to them. So it's but yeah, definitely back then I was just being closeted. You're just going to be way more not inclined to talk about it. But now that everyone knows, I'm I have no problem with speaking up and talking about trans issues or even my own experience.
Now, we have the first 4 issues of Gumballs collected in the trade. Do you plan to continue with the single issue comic book format of Gumballs?
I think we're going to wait to see how, because I've asked that too with my publisher, and I think it's just we're waiting to see how well it does. If it does well, we'll continue. If it doesn't do well, then I think that'll probably be the end of it. So if people like it, they should keep buying it. So then I can keep making Gumballs.
Yeah, buy the single issues as well as the new trade that just came out.
Yeah, I think it's based all on the trade. So if people want to see more single issues, get the trade paperback.
Yeah, and again, I mean, it's not often that alternative or indie publishers like Top Shelf puts out individual comic book issues, and so I think that's one of the reasons why Gumballs really stood out to me. So if you don't continue with the single issue series, do you have plans for maybe a longer form narrative that would take its place?
That's what I've been thinking about. I haven't really talked about it or anything, but in the back of my mind, that's what I've been thinking about. And I really should sit down and just create a big plan for it. But I think I was just waiting to see where this went before I got too into it. I mean, I really wish that I had enough time to do both. But if anyone knows anything about comics, they don't you can't exactly make a living off of them sometimes. So I do have to have my day job that I work at 40 hours a week. So it's very hard. It was hard enough to even create these comics. It's probably the reason why I chose to have it quarterly, just because I need all the time to get it made.
Well, where do you find the time having to work 40 hours? Still at the grocery store?
Yeah, it is. I just don't sleep. It's been kind of, I don't have because I don't have a deadline for a next issue or anything while we are waiting to see how well this does. It's been kind of nice where it's a little bit more relaxed, where I'm not oh, this deadline's coming up in a month, so I need to really work on this. But whenever all of last year, it was pretty stressful. And for the most part, I was single for so long, but I've now been in a relationship for a year, and it's even harder to find time because I could easily just like come home and go straight to just working on it and stay up till like 10 o'clock at night. But now I'm just like, no, there's someone else I need to use my time with, both because I want to, but also because they would like to spend time with me too.
Well, what originally brought you to Top Shelf?
It was the relationship with I knew Brett from teaching or the class that he taught that I took from him. At the time when I took the class, he was at Top Shelf. And I think the year the year before I got signed with Top Shelf, he had actually left the company, but he was still still friends and still speaks with Chris Starros, who's the chief editor at Top Shelf. And so he had encouraged me to put together a comic book, and he was like, let me see if Chris would be interested in this. And he liked it. So that's pretty much how that came about.
Now, in mapping out where you may go from here, you said you're kind of waiting and seeing what kind of response there'll be to this trade Gumballs. Have you sat down much with Chris Starros to talk about single issue, long form narrative, what might be better for you?
I haven't. I know I'm going to be seeing him soon, so I was like thinking about probably like bringing it up then. Because at this moment I haven't really talked about what's next. I've talked about as far as Gumballs, what's next, but I haven't talked about other projects that I could potentially work on, and if they would be interested in publishing them.
So is there anything that you're doing to help publicize Gumballs? Are you going to any cons? Are you doing any signings for this trade?
I'm actually going to New Orleans this week on Thursday. I'm flying out for the American Library Association conference, which I was told it's like Comic-Con for librarians. Mm-hmm. So I'll be on some panels there. And then I'm going to be going to San Diego Comic-Con next month. I'll be doing like the Portland Zine Symposium, which is just like here in Portland. And I'm not quite sure if I can sell Gumballs there. Maybe like an issue I can, but if they really want you to focus on self-published stuff. And then I'll be at FlameCon in New York in August. And if anything else comes up, I've like signed up for, or I applied to Short Run in Seattle. So that might happen in November if I get in.
You mentioned the Library Association. It strikes me, especially since more and more libraries are putting more effort into building their graphic novel, as they call it, collection, that Gumballs would, I guess, in some ways sit really well among library collections. On the other hand, I can see where maybe some more conservative libraries may want to pull back. I'm curious what kind of reaction you've had from librarians and Gumballs.
From what I hear, from like what my publisher have said, they're very excited about it. So the response that I've heard is all good. I have never received like a bad response. Everyone seems actually pretty excited about it, which feels pretty good and positive.
That is good. What panels are you going to be on at the Library Association conference?
Oh, I forget. I know one has to do with identity. I forget, like they have like long names that I cannot remember. I will definitely find out, and I will be posting on social media for everyone to where to find me. And I know that if they were to go on, if anyone listening, if they wanted to know, well, I don't know if this podcast will be up by then. But I know that people could go online and you could search my name and all those would pop up.
Now, you mentioned your time and the restrictions that have been placed on that lately. Is there something maybe that you can share with us that you may be working on now that's not Gumballs?
Actually, I did. It's a zine that it's like a collaborative zine that I'm working on with my girlfriend, and it's basically just I have comics in there, and because she's also an artist, and she has illustrations, and it's called Sure to Fall, and
Sure to Fall,
and it's being printed actually this week. So I'm not sure when we're going to actually have the release date for it. as soon as I have copies, I'll be bringing them with me to all these events that I go to. So that's like the current project I've been working on. And then I think I might put together like another zine. Zines are way more affordable for me to make if I'm printing stuff myself. But I don't have any other. And then, actually I do have, I'm not sure when it's going to come out. I do have a comic in the We're Still Here. It's an all trans anthology. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure. That might come out next month, but I'm not 100% sure.
Okay, so We're Still Here. Who's publishing that?
Stack Deck Press.
Okay. And if people attend the cons that you had mentioned that you're attending, you know, they're going to be able to get these mini comics from you. But what if our listeners are, you know, big fans of Gumball, but they're not going to be traveling to these conferences? Is there a way for them to get a copy of these mini comics online?
Yeah. I'll probably put them on. I have an online store. It's like there's a link to my website. If they just go to like erinnations.com, there's a link to a store. So as soon as I have them, I'll have them up there as well.
Okay. So even while people are waiting for Gumballs, they can still get their dose of Erin Nations.
Oh yeah. I'll always be creating something, even if it's something small that I'm like self-publishing myself. Yeah, there'll always be something available for people to read.
That's really good to know. And, you know, I hope to see more of Gumballs, but whether your next work is in single issue format of Gumballs or something else, I look forward to seeing what you come up with next.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. Erin, thank you very much for taking the time and talking with me for the podcast, and best of luck at these conferences.
Thank you very much.
A big thanks once again to Erin Nations for taking the time to talk with me about the new Gumballs trade. And if you liked what you heard, then check out the website of our sponsor, Discount Comic Book Service. Go to dcbservice.com right now, and as I mentioned at the top of the show, you can find Gumballs for 35% off of the cover price. That's dcbservice.com. And after you do get your comics there, get in touch with me and let me know what you thought about my interview with Erin Nations. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can contact us the old-fashioned way by picking up your telephone and dialing 4153-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427. You can also email us. We're 2guys@comicsalternative.com, or you can contact me directly. I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com. And you can also find us all over social media. We have accounts on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, YouTube, Slack, and Discord. You can subscribe to the podcast through Apple Podcasts. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on TuneIn, on Spotify, on iHeartRadio, and on Google Play Music. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we occasionally post on the blog, simply by going to the website, comicsalternative.com. We've got more interviews lined up in the days to come, so please be sure to check back for those. Until then, take care.